Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, the Washington, D.C. campus for Hillsdale College. My name is Michael Kelsey, and I'm the Research Fellow at the Kirby Center. We are excited today to host a discussion by Senator Mike Lee of Utah, Representatives Jeb Hensarling of Texas, Mark Walker of North Carolina, and Dave Bratt of Virginia on the Article I Project's Regulatory Budget Act. As a center devoted to the study of constitutional principles, the Kirby Center firmly supports the Article I Project's goal to restore the legislative powers of Congress and was honored to host the initial launch of the Article I Project last January. Today's first speaker is Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Mike Lee graduated from BYU with a Bachelor's of Science in Political Science in 1994 and BYU's Law School in 1997, before clerking for Supreme Court Justice Judge Samuel Alito twice, once when he was on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and again when he became a Supreme Court Justice. He was elected to the Senate in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mike Lee.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks for hosting us yet again at the Kirby Center. It's always a good place to be, especially when we're launching something to try to reinvigorate the Constitution. Right underneath this beautiful portrait here makes this a perfect setting. It was almost 4 months ago that we gathered right here underneath the same portrait to launch the Article I Project, this network, this House and Senate network, an internal congressional think tank, if you will, working together on a new agenda of government reform and of congressional rehabilitation. The starting point for our agenda with the Article I Project is the simple observation that the federal government is broken. It's not just that it's not functioning. It is functioning. It's just not functioning in the manner that it is supposed to function. It's not functioning in the manner in which it's supposed to function under its own rule book, established in 1787. Congressional weakness, deliberate weakness, is really to blame for all of this. It's at the heart of the fact that the federal government's not working in the manner that it's supposed to work. It's important not to conflate a broken federal government with an inoperative federal government. Likewise, we must be careful not to assume that congressional weakness is equivalent somehow to congressional innocence. A lot of the greatest constitutional misdeeds in this town occur not as a result of simply action, but also sometimes as a result of willful inaction. Indeed, the problem that we're here to address today, the problem of our hyperactive executive branch bureaucracy, writing upwards of 95% of federal laws without a single vote in Congress or without receiving a single vote at the ballot box, was primarily created by the legislative branch itself. It was created by members of Congress themselves for their own political convenience. So sometimes when you hear members of Congress talk about the aggressive federal regulatory system and the fact that we've got so many federal regulations coming out, they speak almost as if we were victims. We are not victims. We are the perpetrators. Congress created this problem. Congress must fix this problem, if ever it is to be fixed. So at first glance, this may seem counterintuitive. After all, why would Congress willfully relinquish its legislative authority, given that that legislative authority is exclusively granted to Congress? In fact, the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution gives us that power. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It makes clear that you cannot create law in the federal system without us. We must act. We are the ones who must legislate. We are the only ones given legislative power. And more to the point, if the lawmaking power is now being exercised, as it is, by the executive branch, if these lawmaking powers were not usurped by bureaucratic agents, why is it so common to hear members of Congress rail against the federal bureaucracy and accuse its rule-writing agencies of executive overreach? So this gets us to the difficult question of why. Why does this happen? To understand why members of Congress would intentionally empower federal bureaucrats to do the job, to cut the grass of Congress itself, to legislate for them, for the entire country. To understand that we need to recognize that lawmaking is not just power. It's not just a prerogative. It's also a responsibility that comes with that power. In the animated video that many of us knew as children and came to know as children, we see that legislating is hard work. That's the lesson from that classic Schoolhouse Rock episode, I'm Just a Bill, which I should note for the young people in the room, you can view on YouTube. Even though it no longer airs with Saturday morning cartoons, as I wish it did, it recently appeared on an episode of Saturday Night Live, albeit in a somewhat distorted form, explaining not bills but executive orders. That's also a very good video, but both of them can be viewed on YouTube. Now, in that video, a walking and talking legislative bill sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill, just a block away from us, explains to a young boy how laws are made within the federal government, at least how laws are supposed to be made within the federal government. The process is long. The process amounts to what the cartoon describes as a long, long journey through Congress's parallel committee systems. And it involves a long, long wait as members of the House and members of the Senate amend the bill, debate the bill in order to build the consensus needed for a majority vote in both houses, and in order for them to have the opportunity to send it all along to the president, who can then either sign the bill into law or veto it. Of course, they don't cover the other option, which is to allow it to pass into law silently without signature, but that's okay. Nor do they cover the pocket veto, but I think that can be a next episode of Schoolhouse Rock once we reinvigorate that trend. Zeroing in on the moral of the story, the boy finally asks, "It's not easy to become a law, is it? Not an easy process." No, it's not, nor should we expect it to be. There are 535 members of Congress, representing some 318 million Americans living in thousands of communities across 50 sovereign states in our country. It's not easy for a group that large and that diverse to agree on anything, let alone what the nation's laws should be, let alone the composition of a rule to which every American will be subject. Legislating isn't just difficult and time-consuming, it's also risky. It is politically risky for those involved in the process, and it is unavoidably necessarily so. In the sense that if after all that work, you're a member of Congress and your constituents dislike the legislation that you wrote or that you supported or that you even voted for, they may vote you out of office the next time they get the chance if they don't like that legislation. Now, over the past century, primarily over the last 80 years, successive generations of elected policymakers in Congress, and I would add here members of Congress in Congresses of every conceivable partisan combination, have sought to escape those risks and have sought to escape the political accountability that goes along necessarily with those risks by writing laws containing broad statements. So they try to avoid the process and the risks that go along with the process by writing these broad standards and then issuing a broad mandate to an outside entity, a federal bureaucracy, to come up with their own rules carrying the force of law that will then take effect without further congressional action and without any additional congressional accountability. They just delegate to the executive branch the power to determine all of the specifics. And of course, the specifics are where the details are. The specifics are where the risks are. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. used to say that there is a point of contact in every case. And he said that the point of contact is defined as the place where the boy got his finger caught in the machinery. And I would add here that there is a point of contact in almost every piece of legislation. And that point of contact is often defined as the place where the lawmaker got in trouble with the lawmaker's constituents. That's just what happens when you make real laws, when you actually make a difference, when you impose rules on the American people. It is supposed to be risky. It is unavoidably risky. But it is us as members of Congress who are supposed to bear those risks because we're supposed to make the laws. For the rule-writing bureaucrats, these open-ended, platitudinous laws are gifts that keep on giving. For instance, in the years since Congress first passed the Clean Air Act of 1977, federal bureaucrats have used the law to enact more than 13,500 pages of regulations, roughly 30 pages for every page of legislative text. But for the American people, this kind of government without consent, regardless of the outcome, regardless of whatever positive implications might be brought, regardless of whatever positive outcomes that might be brought about by the regulations, these are things that insulate lawmakers from their constituents, and these are things that make the government ultimately less accountable. This kind of government without consent is a violation of the social compact that is at the heart of our constitutional republic, and is exactly why so many voters no longer trust the federal government, because they feel like they have no say in it, because in many, many cases they don't, because in many, many cases the laws by which they are governed are written by people not of their own choosing. They're written by people who don't work for the people, they can't be fired by the people, they never stand for election, and they're not really even accountable in any direct sort of way to anyone who is elected by the people. So we've got to earn back the American people's trust. And earning back their trust is the chief objective of the Article 1 project's agenda to re-empower Congress, and it's why we are today introducing the Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, a bill that will put the legislative branch back in charge of the federal regulatory state, and by extension, to put the American people back in charge of Washington. I'll let my colleagues dig into the details of the legislation. I look forward to the input of the esteemed panelists that we'll hear from later this morning. If you're interested in learning more about this reform and about the ideas behind it, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the A1P policy brief, Leashing Leviathan, the case for a congressional regulatory budget. It's now my privilege to hand over the podium to my friend and Article 1 project partner, Congressman Jeb Hensarling from Texas. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for caring enough to come out this morning and to echo Mike's comments. It is most sobering and most humbling to be delivering remarks under this wonderful painting, and to know that in some way, shape, or form, through some metaphysical balance of the universe, the founders are looking over our shoulder and reminding us it is a republic if we can keep it. This ground here, the Kirby Center, in some respects is hallowed ground for the Constitution and those who love the Constitution. I thank you for once again hosting the Article 1 project. As Senator Lee said, this is where the project was launched. I am so grateful to him for coming up with this brainchild, allowing me to be his co-chair for this project, and I'm very thankful for all my colleagues who have joined us today. I first wanted to start my discussion with a quick review of the cost of government. When people think about the cost of government, they usually think about the $19 trillion of debt and counting. And for those who've ever been to the House Financial Services Committee, you know we keep a real-time debt clock churning. It, too, is most sobering. Others think of the trillions of dollars that are spent each year in the federal budget, much of it unwisely. But there is another cost of government, and that is the cost of federal regulations. According to the American Competitive Enterprise Institute, the estimated cost of federal regulations in 2015 was almost $1.9 trillion. And to put this in perspective, the federal government spent $3 $8.7 trillion last year. Thus, the cost of regulations is equal to roughly half the size of other federal spending. Together, the cost of federal spending and regulation, $5.5 trillion, all paid for in some form or fashion by the American people. This figure of government regulation, this figure dwarfs the economy of all other nations except that of ours and China. But unfortunately, the cost of federal regulation is not something that is readily identifiable or apparent or to be found in any official government report. Yet it is felt every day by the American people. I vividly recall a small businessman in my district, my congressional district in East Texas, who told me after many, many years he shut his small cabinetry shop because of the burden of regulation, and he told me, sadly, I came to the conclusion my government no longer wanted me to succeed. But far more disturbing than the monetary cost of these rules is the far greater cost of how these regulations are imposed. And it is not often by the people's elected representatives. In other words, the cost of regulation cannot be measured in just monetary terms, but it must be measured in their damage to our Constitution as well. So Congress may have passed a law authorizing a federal agency to make regulations, but more often than not, these agencies go much further in taking actions and license in Congress that probably few may have foreseen at the time the original law was passed. Separation of power and checks and balances suffer when that happens. Often these agencies will engage in what the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia called, quote, somersaults of statutory interpretation. And because this regulation is often done by faceless, nameless bureaucrats in Washington, the American people have no opportunity to hold them accountable for the cost they impose. Article 1 suffers. Now, sometimes, as Senator Lee has pointed out, this lack of accountability is not by accident. By delegating the dirty work of legislation to the faceless bureaucrats to, in many respects, figuratively write the statute, members of Congress can vote for legislation empowering these regulators, and then how mightily when the regulations come out in ways that they do not appreciate. Thus, members of Congress can avoid responsibility and work less hard. This must change. The sheer genius of our Constitution, the framework of checks and balances, limited government, co-equal branches of government, secured our fundamental rights and gave rise to the greatest republic the world has ever known. But today we wake up and find instead of having three co-equal branches of government, we have seen the rise of an unaccountable fourth branch of government. And when Congress allows its authority to be usurped, the people's right to both self-government and due process is undermined. Instead of being governed by the rule of law, increasingly citizens become more and more governed by the rule of rulers. The citizens' right to carefully deliberate proposed legislation through their elected representatives in Congress becomes reduced to nothing more than a notice and comment period where they are permitted to merely lodge complaints and suggestions, all of which the unelected bureaucrats are free to ignore, all of which the unelected bureaucrats may use to retaliate. The result, we now have federal agencies that have turned themselves into a legislature, a cop on the beat, a judge, a jury, and often recipient of the fine, all rolled into one. Again, today, regrettably, it is OSHA, not Congress, that governs over workplace safety. It is now EPA, not Congress, that rules over our air quality. It is HHS now, not Congress, that governs over our health care. And most alarmingly to our economic opportunity and economic liberty is the bureaucratic progeny of Dodd-Frank that now rules over our financial markets. For the good of the republic, this must change. Stability of our system of government depends on a representative, transparent, and accountable Congress to make the laws. We all know and revere Article 1, Section 1, where our Constitution states, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. It does not say EPA, OSHA, or Dodd-Frank. In order to confront the so-called fourth branch of government and restore the constitutional order and legislative supremacy of Article 1, we clearly need new tools. And that is precisely why we are here today, to unveil legislation creating a regulatory budget. And again, I congratulate my co-chair, Senator Lee, for carrying this bill in the Senate, and my House colleague, Mark Walker of North Carolina, who you will hear from shortly, for carrying this bill in the House. As I said earlier, federal regulations come with a cost, albeit a hidden one. The American people can look up in the federal budget and see a monetary cost of the IRS, the EPA. They should also be able to look up what the regulatory cost of these agencies are as well. Beyond making the cost of federal regulation transparent, a regulatory budget will help restore accountability for the cost of regulation onto the people's elected representatives. With a regulatory budget, it will become so much more difficult for members of Congress to simply pass the buck and blame the faceless, nameless bureaucrats for the cost of regulations upon the American people's families and their businesses. There is so much more that we need to do to restore constitutional order and the supremacy of Article 1. But today we take one more important step under the Article 1 project. It is what it is all about, and I am proud to play a small role in these initiatives, and I'm very happy today that you will hear more about the regulatory budget proposal and what we can do to restore the supremacy of Article 1. Now I am very pleased to turn over the podium to the gentleman from Virginia, Dave Bratt, a proud member of the A1P project as well.
All right. A couple of years ago, I was teaching economic classes in front of kids, and if you told me I'd have to follow these two characters in about a year, I'd fall over and faint from nerves. And so it's an honor to be with you all. Thank you for your remarks. The picture up there, I'm kind of coming up batting third. We just heard from Madison and then Jefferson, right? Some eloquent people. I think I'm going to be Patrick Henry. I'm just going to yell at you. So just relax a little bit, right? Inhale, have a little fun. And I came over, I was just going to make one point, and Mike Lee got to the point. The Article 1 project, he said, is an effort to regain the trust of the American people, right? And so that, for me, is kind of the key. And at its core, we have the architects, and Mark will fill you in on the details of what's coming up on the project itself. But at base right now, I think we all know the problem in the country is the politics, right? How are we going to do this? And so Mike's right. We have to have a regulatory budget for the executive overreach, right? We all know it's out of control. It's $2 trillion a year. But it just runs in parallel with the issues I've been dealing. I'm on the budget committee, and it's the same exact issue, right? There are some areas where we still retain the power of the purse, right? And so this just reemphasizes what Senator Lee was saying. We've done this to ourselves. Right? This year, do we have the constitutional power to set a lower top line federal budget number that we move forward with? Yes. Do we have the power to defund if we really fight tooth and nail on executive overreach? Yes. Right? And so I could go down the list. We're not doing that. I'll give you a couple of highlights from what I've been dealing with. Yesterday, we had the governor from Virginia up. No comment on that story. Wait for the evidence to come in on all that. But very interesting story again. And we had all the secretaries from Virginia with our governor. And we got into it on the EPA for some reason. That was the one that got our attention. And so Morgan Griffith and the governor and the secretaries got into it just for a little bit on the issue. And it was forced on us by EPA in Virginia. And Virginia fought back and said, we want you to come down here and tell us you're forcing this on us. So that was at least clever, right? So there are ways we can make the political process work in our favor. We had the EPA come down to Virginia and admit in public that they were forcing this agenda on us. And just to give you an idea of the scale, this is what's missing, right, on the regulatory overreach. The EPA project is $20 billion. $20 $20 billion, now up here, sorry, I can see you all rolling your eyes. It's like, whoop-de-doo. What's $20 billion up here, right? That's the general fund in the Virginia budget for a year, right? That's our budget for a year. So we're talking about an EPA program, $20 billion with the Bay, which is important, clean water, but we're broke, right? And so there's no balancing act going across all these agencies. And then right next off come the Secretary of Transportation, we need more money. Secretary of Education, we need more money, et cetera. Last week in committee, I was the only no vote in the Education Committee on the nutrition bill. Yeah, what's the headline there? Next day, Dave Brett against food for kids or something, right? Dave Brett against nutrition for kids. So I tried to be politically smart. We block granted the same amount of money, right? So it's not about nutrition and food. Same amount of money back down to the states, right? But just to get the federal intrusion out. And in that debate at the federal level, we were, honest to God, debating what should be in the salad bar at the local school level with Congress last week, right? So I told the chair and some of the leaders, I said, I'm putting in an amendment. I'm so fed up with it. I said, I cannot have Roma tomatoes on the salad bar anymore. I'm putting them in, right? Just as an example, right? This is what your Congress is doing. So there's overreach, and then and we're doing this, right? Just so we're all clear on this. And then the chairman before the meeting got us all in there, and he's budget, Klein from Minnesota, great guy, right? Big 6'5" Marine, scares the crap out of me. Corbello, and if I do this for Corbello, then I can't do this for Grothman from Wisconsin, and good God, Bratt won't work on anything with us. He's just incorrigible or whatever, right? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm going, oh God, I said, Mr. Chair, I just have to say, I said, if we follow this logic, the reason I'm a no on this is if we follow this logic, next year in this committee on education, we're going to be talking about bathrooms in this committee. Within an hour, I said that in humor. The Democrats brought that up in committee, right, on the nutrition bill, right? So once you allow federal overreach to a certain degree, $4 trillion a year, it's game over, right? If you allow the feds to intrude, then you have the debate going on every single issue, and it clogs the arteries. So I'll just close. I think I was only supposed to go a couple minutes. Jefferson and Madison laid out the main arguments. I'll just follow Jeb. This issue is going to force itself on us, even if we don't get it right ahead of time. In 10 years, all federal revenues are going to go only to mandatory spending programs. I think everybody knows that, right? That's the main graph on CBO. In 10 years, all federal revenues will go to only mandatory spending, right? Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, healthcare, et cetera. So if you follow that, there won't be a dollar left for the military, transportation, education, everything we're debating, right? Not a dollar left of federal revenues. And so just by coincidence, guess what the deficit is in 10 years? A little over $1 trillion. So you'll have to deficit finance the entire budget of the United States, right? The functioning, running government piece, right? The discretionary part right now. You'll have to deficit finance the entire federal government. So the numbers are going to force us to do the right thing. I'm just trying to put it to the people that way, because in the end, it comes back to what they laid out. We have to change the mindset of the people. So you got to first share the facts with the people. And what that means is I see nice young people nodding your heads. Thank you for the nice smiles. That's nice of you. Makes me feel better up here, right? If we don't get it right, in 18 years, Medicare and Social Security are insolvent, right? So you guys will be 36 years old, right? So when they're 36, the major programs in the country are insolvent. I don't think we want that. And so I applaud the architects here for putting together this day and for you guys hosting us here. And thanks for letting me say a few words. And with that, I'll give you my colleague, Mark Walker, a fine gentleman from the Carolinas.
Yeah, I am from North Carolina. It's good to be here. As you might know, North Carolina has been in the news a little bit lately. We are not running from that, and proud that our governor is working hard on some of this. This is a big day. It may not grab every headline today, but this is establishing a precedent, a new way, really the old way that we're just bringing it back due to the great leadership certainly of Senator Lee and Congressman Hensarling. Appreciate both of your hard work on this. You've been great examples, especially for some of the newer members that are coming in, that you can be, let me use this term, effectively conservative. Think about it again. We can be effectively conservative, and that's certainly something that we're striving to do. I was talking with Senator Lee as we were getting ready to start, and I said, you know what, the amazing thing about this is nonpartisan. You think about this. This isn't just tilted one side or the other. This is nonpartisan when it comes to returning the power to the people. It's a privilege to be here. It always is here at the Kirby Center. Thank you for such good work. You guys do a great job of hosting and bringing people in to encourage and certainly to share and get the word out. This group came together under a simple idea, a group that I'm very proud to be part of. Simply this: the federal government, as you've heard already, and I'll reiterate, has become unaccountable to the people that it serves. And really, at the crux of it, it's diluted the power of Congress. The people's members that are sent here, the power has been diluted. Over time, Congress has chosen, instead of to engage in hard work and to put your shoulder to the grind and engage, it's relinquished more of its lawmaking power to the federal agencies. I serve on the House Oversight. I was here 3 weeks when I realized there's a major issue when a presidential appointee by this President Obama, the Inspector General, is reaching out to our Republican-led committee because for 3 years the EPA won't respond to his letters. Knew right away there's a little bit of an issue here. Now this has become a way for lawmakers at the end of the day to be a little less accountable, to avoid the accountability, to not get in the crux of it, to not have to make the difficult choices and votes. The result has been this: an out-on-control regulatory framework that adds approximately $2 trillion in cost, $2 trillion in cost on the economy and American small businesses every single year. For example, in 2014, the people, elected representatives, passed more than 3,000 pages of new laws, while federal bureaucracies issued more than 80,000 pages of regulations, about 24 times as much. We've seen it even with this administration and the president. We went from 68,000 pages of IRS tax code regulations to now over 75,000 tax code regulations, all without a single vote ever being cast. Interesting. This isn't the way it was supposed to be. It wasn't the way that it was designed, and it is time to come to an end. That's why I love working with these guys who are willing to step out and say it's time to be accountable. It's time for Congress to reassert its constitutional rule-making authority and bring accountability back to the process. We see it all the time, the overreach. In fact, was it 2 weeks ago this Thursday, we saw the president talk about how we're going to operate our bathrooms. We immediately jumped on that, and I was glad that 75 of my colleagues joined me with a letter to the president asking specifically how you plan to enforce this. Putting our teachers in the front lines of the issues that were never designed to do so. And that's why today we are here to introduce Article 1 regulatory budget. Again, this is a big day. It would effectively limit the cost of regulations and an expansion of the regulatory state. It would require Congress to set a regulatory burden budget for each federal agency. Let me say that again. It requires Congress to set a regulatory burden budget for each federal agency. And I know there's going to be some people in these agencies that are not thrilled to hear that, but nevertheless, it's coming. This is a first step toward putting Congress back in charge of the federal regulatory state. I want to continue to thank my colleagues. I'm excited about this. This morning, I'm in the middle of a committee on Homeland Security markup. I will have to transition out. But these are the kind of battles that we need to be engaging with. There's a chance here to really change the course of how this place is governed. Is it going to be easy? No, it's not. But the members, these gentlemen, others who are willing to fight and take up the cause, continue to support them. We appreciate that encouragement. God bless you. It's always a privilege to be with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have if you want to raise those. We'll start over here.
You know, I don't see any, unless somebody can point them out to me, any career politicians up there. And I think that's the basis of what you're talking about. And I think you're right. It's really taking a risk to put yourself on the line, perhaps to be not around here in a few years, but perhaps what we're talking about is maybe it's a good thing that not necessarily you guys, but a lot of guys are not around here in a few years. Thank you.
It's a fair point. I mean, look, I don't think that the Founding Fathers necessarily contemplated serving in Congress as a lifelong career, as a career-long enterprise. But regardless of whether they did, I don't know for sure whether they did. Even if some of them had, even if that's exactly what they intended, doubt that it was, even if it had been. The fact is that if you want to do that, you ought still to be on the hook to do the things that only Congress can do. And it's part of the job, whether you like it or not. Whether you get reelected or not, and how many times you get reelected is up to your voters. But if you're not doing your job by making the laws, you're harming your constituents.
Well, I would just add the ultimate term limit is the voters deciding to send someone home. And part of what we're trying to do here with this particular legislative initiative is make sure that the people's elected representatives have to take more responsibility ultimately for the cost of government. Again, it is not a panacea, but it is an important step forward to both be able to appreciate and understand and measure the cost of government, but to put that responsibility back on the people's elected representatives, and there will be greater accountability there.
I agree with you. I put in a term limit thing. I term limit myself to 12 years.
Thanks. Is this one? Thanks for what you're doing. I think it's a very important thing. The question I had is there a tension between the largeness of bills that get passed and the attempt to sort of shorten that or simplify that by passing it off to the regulators? I mean, because there seems to be this problem where on one hand you have these massive bills that no one reads, and on the other hand you have the simplification process is to just insert the secretary will determine this, so you have a shorter, simpler bill that gets passed off. So I mean, how does that work? Is there a tension there, or how do you propose to square that?
Okay, so yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? So we do have these bills. You're referring to some of my least favorite bills that we confront. In December, just a few days before Congress adjourned before Christmas, we were presented with a 2,242-page Christmas gift, an omnibus appropriations bill. And that was made public roughly 48 hours before the first vote was cast in the House of Representatives. The Senate voted within 24 hours or so after it was passed by the House. I don't know about you, but reading 2,242 pages is not an easy task to perform within 48 hours. It is, in fact, an impossible task to perform if the object is to make sure you understand it fully before voting on it. So, yeah, your question is an interesting one because if we are passing not laws but broad platitudinous statements coupled with delegations of authority, that would seem to be in conflict. At the end of the day, when you look at the work product, we tend to produce a few hundred pages, at most a few thousand pages of legislative text in a year. Those are the laws that we pass. It can usually be put in a stack that measures a few inches tall. By contrast, the Federal Register, which is the annual cumulative index of all federal regulations, as they're released for notice and comment and later finalized. They're 11 feet tall. The bottom line, to answer your question, is that this underscores the sheer complexity of the federal government, an entity that spends $4 trillion a year, nearly. We've got a lot of really long bills. Those bills are kept secret very often until the very last minute, especially the really long ones that you're describing. Some of those bills are also full of delegations of authority. So with the Affordable Care Act, for instance, that was a very long bill, a couple thousand pages long. members of the House were told that they had to pass it in order to find out what was in it. And yet it, in addition to its own length and complexity on its own, contained hundreds upon hundreds of delegations of de facto lawmaking authority. Dodd-Frank was similar in that respect. And so one form of complexity begets another. And so, both are problems that need to be addressed. And another aspect of the Article 1 project's mission is to avoid legislating by cliff. Legislating by cliff refers to the process by which these bills, normally the omnibus appropriations bills, sometimes they can happen in another area, but there's an artificial deadline created by Congress, a deadline by which a certain amount of work has to be done. And if it's not done, then bad things are going to happen. And so that helps facilitate the passage of these really long, complex bills that no one's read. That's another aspect of the Article 1 project's mission that we'll be addressing through other proposals.
I agree with everything he said. I came in on Obama's overreach on unconstitutional amnesty just off the election, right? A year and a half ago, promising on the issues, I'd read the bills, I'm not going to vote for something unconstitutional. The first week I'm up here, it's everything in one bill. It was just unbelievable. But I'll give you my summary. You said, are they long, long, short, da-da-da-da-da. For you young people out here, I'll give you the answer to everything in life. On earth, right? Not in heaven. In heaven, there's different answers. Down here, just follow the money. That's the answer to every single question you have, right? When it comes to whether the bill's long or short, whatever maximizes the revenues to whoever's involved. And it's fascinating up here. Mark Walker earlier said this thing is bipartisan. It is. And this whole city, I get a kick out of it. The press makes this big deal out of this right-wing, left-wing ideology, right? There's a ideological war between you hard right knuckle draggers and the hard left. It's total false narrative, right? I work out with the lefties every morning in the weight room. We all get along fine and dandy. I met Bernie Sanders at the White House Christmas party. I said to him, Bernie, I said, I'm a freshman guy. I'm not putting you on the spot. You don't have to answer this. But I said, all I see up here, I said, I don't see this right-wing, left-wing thing going on at all. I see everybody up here in the middle is doling out $4 trillion in the budget. That's what I see going on up here, right? And he said, well, hell yeah, Dave, what the hell you think going on up here? That's what's going on up here, right? And so, I mean, when you got Dave Bratton and Bernie agreeing on the fundamentals of how this place works, that's why this project is so important.
Well, personally, I've never partied down with Bernie at the White House, but I'm sure that's
You're missing it, man.
I'm sure that's a unique experience. I probably can go through life without it. A lot has been said. I would just say it's an interesting question to ponder. I think great mischief has been done in small bills. Great mischief has been done in large bills as well. It is easier, obviously, to hide the mischief in a large bill, but should one be a small government conservative, frankly, a large bill can be full of repeal language, and there is much to be repealed.
You are all leading the effort to end regulation without representation. Mm-hmm. And I think you all probably support the REINS Act to require that Congress approve major new federal regulations. But you'd probably all agree that it's going to be hard to get 60 votes in the Senate, and the next time the Democrats get a supermajority, they could repeal it. So my question is, what would any of you like, or what are your thoughts about this Regulation Freedom Amendment, which is the constitutional version of the REINS Act to require that regulations have to be approved by Congress, which is now backed by 900 state legislators, unanimous vote of the Republican National Committee, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, American Farm Bureau, National Taxpayers Union. What are your thoughts on that amendment and the idea that maybe in the same way that states forced Congress to propose the Bill of Rights, pressure from the states without a convention could force Congress to do some kind of regulatory reform?
Well, I'll jump in first. Having sponsored or actually authored a couple of constitutional amendments in my own career, including a spending limit amendment, I think we all know that getting a constitutional amendment passed is very, very heavy lifting. I have not studied the language carefully. I certainly would approve the concept. I think that the REINS Act on a statutory level is one of the most important laws we could pass for reclaiming our Article I legislative powers and for restoring balance within our Constitution. I would prefer to have that protected in the Constitution, but I think we probably have to win the battle that is before us before the one that's over the hill. And the battle that is before us is, can we get enough initiative going to get this passed into law? And so that's where my focus is.
Yeah, I agree. The passage of the REINS Act is one of the most important things we can do. So this is the Regulatory Budget Act that we're talking about today solves one aspect of the problem. It in no way replaces the need for the REINS Act, and we really need it. I mean, if you're interested in reading more about this, I came out with a book about a year ago called Our Lost Constitution. In Our Lost Constitution, I explained the history of the modern regulatory system. It was created basically during the FDR administration. And one of the New Deal architects of this system was a Harvard law professor named James Landis, who explained at the very outset that to make the regulatory system legitimate, constitutionally speaking, any rules that carry the force of law that were imposed on the American people by these agencies would need to be approved by Congress. In other words, they would need to be treated effectively as proposals. If you're going to regulate the time the lights go on in the Department of State or the Department of Commerce, that's one thing. But if you're going to regulate and issue regulations that are laws affecting the day-to-day lives of the American people, those require enactment by Congress. And that's what's been missing for a long time. So, yeah, I think we need to support the REINS Act. And I think I'd be great with inserting something into the Constitution that would back that up. But we got to get the REINS Act passed first. That's the easier thing to do. That's not to say we shouldn't push on both ends. I'm told I've got to go vote. Have I got time before I leave? Can I take one more question?
Apparently not.
Okay, they're calling a vote, and I'm going to have to leave.
We all have to.
But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.
Okay, we'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have if you want to raise those. We'll start over here.
You know, I don't see any, unless somebody can point them out to me, any career politicians up there. And I think that's the basis of what you're talking about. And I think you're right. It's really taking a risk to put yourself on the line, perhaps to be not around here in a few years. But perhaps what we're talking about is maybe it's a good thing that not necessarily you guys, but a lot of guys are not around here in a few years. Thank you.
It's a fair point. I mean, look, I don't think that the Founding Fathers necessarily contemplated serving in Congress as a lifelong career, as a career-long enterprise. But regardless of whether they did, I don't know for sure whether they did. Even if some of them had, even if that's exactly what they intended, I doubt that it was, even if it had been. The fact is that if you want to do that, you ought still to be on the hook to do the things that only Congress can do. And it's part of the job, whether you like it or not. Whether you get reelected or not, and how many times you get reelected is up to your voters. But if you're not doing your job by making the laws, you're harming your constituents.
Well, I would just add the ultimate term limit is the voters deciding to send someone home. And part of what we're trying to do here with this particular legislative initiative is make sure that the people's elected representatives have to take more responsibility ultimately for the cost of government. Again, it is not a panacea, but it is an important step forward to both be able to appreciate and understand and measure the cost of government, but to put that responsibility back on the people's elected representatives, and there will be greater accountability there.
I agree with you. I put in a term limit thing. I term limit myself to 12 years.
Is this one? Thanks for what you're doing. I think it's a very important thing. Um, the question I had is there a tension between the largeness of bills that get passed and the attempt to sort of shorten that or simplify that by passing it off to the regulators? I mean, because there seems to be this problem where on one hand you have these massive bills that no one reads, and on the other hand, you have the simplification process is to, just insert the secretary will determine this. So you have a shorter, simpler bill that gets passed off. So, I mean, how does that work? Is there a tension there, or how do you propose to square that?
Okay, so yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? So we do have these bills. You're referring to some of my least favorite bills that we confront. In December, just a few days before Congress adjourned before Christmas, we were presented with a 2,242-page Christmas gift, an omnibus appropriations bill. And that was made public roughly 48 hours before the first vote was cast in the House of Representatives. The Senate voted within 24 hours or so after it was passed by the House. I don't know about you, but reading 2,242 pages is not an easy task to perform within 48 hours. It is, in fact, an impossible task to perform if the object is to make sure you understand it fully before voting on it. So, yeah, your question is an interesting one because if we are passing not laws but broad platitudinous statements coupled with delegations of authority, that would seem to be in conflict. At the end of the day, when you look at the work product, we tend to produce a few hundred pages, at most a few thousand pages of legislative text in a year. Those are the laws that we pass. It can usually be put in a stack that measures a few inches tall. By contrast, the Federal Register, which is the annual cumulative index of all federal regulations, is they're released for notice and comment and later finalized. They're 11 feet tall. The bottom line, to answer your question, is that this underscores the sheer complexity of the federal government, an entity that spends $4 trillion a year, nearly. We've got a lot of really long bills. Those bills are kept secret very often until the very last minute, especially the really long ones that you're describing. Some of those bills are also full of delegations of authority. So with the Affordable Care Act, for instance, that was a very long bill, a couple thousand pages long. Members of the House were told that they had to pass it in order to find out what was in it. And yet it, in addition to its own length and complexity on its own, contained hundreds upon hundreds of delegations of de facto lawmaking authority. Dodd-Frank was similar in that respect. And so one form of complexity begets another. And so, both are problems that need to be addressed. And another aspect of the Article 1 project's mission is to avoid legislating by cliff. Legislating by cliff refers to the process by which these bills, normally the omnibus appropriations bills, sometimes they can happen in another area, but there's an artificial deadline created by Congress, a deadline by which a certain amount of work has to be done. And if it's not done, then bad things are going to happen. And so that helps facilitate the passage of these really long, complex bills that no one's read. That's another aspect of the Article 1 project's mission that we'll be addressing through other proposals.
I agree with everything he said. I came in on Obama's overreach on unconstitutional amnesty just off the election, right? A year and a half ago, promising on the issues, I'd read the bills, I'm not going to vote for something unconstitutional. The first week I'm up here, it's everything in one bill. It was just unbelievable. But I'll give you my summary. You said, are they long, long, short, da-da-da-da-da. For you young people out here, I'll give you the answer to everything in life. On earth, right? Not in heaven. In heaven, there's different answers. Down here, just follow the money. That's the answer to every single question you have, right? When it comes to whether the bill's long or short, whatever maximizes the revenues to whoever's involved. And it's fascinating up here. Mark Walker earlier said this thing is bipartisan. It is. And this whole city, I get a kick out of it. The press makes this big deal out of this right-wing, left-wing ideology, right? There's a ideological war between you hard right knuckle draggers and the hard left. It's total false narrative, right? I work out with the lefties every morning in the weight room. We all get along fine and dandy. I met Bernie Sanders at the White House Christmas party. I said to him, Bernie, I said, I'm a freshman guy. I'm not putting you on the spot. You don't have to answer this. But I said, all I see up here, I said, I don't see this right-wing, left-wing thing going on at all. I see everybody up here in the middle is doling out $4 trillion in the budget. That's what I see going on up here, right? And he said, well, hell yeah, Dave, what the hell you think going on up here? That's what's going on up here, right? And so, I mean, when you got Dave Bratton and Bernie agreeing on the fundamentals of how this place works, that's why this project is so important.
Well, personally, I've never partied down with Bernie at the White House, but I'm sure that's
You're missing it, man.
I'm sure that's a unique experience. I probably can go through life without it. A lot has been said. I would just say it's an interesting question to ponder. I think great mischief has been done in small bills. Great mischief has been done in large bills as well. It is easier, obviously, to hide the mischief in a large bill, but should one be a small government conservative, frankly, a large bill can be full of repeal language, and there is much to be repealed.
You are all leading the effort to end regulation without representation. Mm-hmm. And I think you all probably support the REINS Act to require that Congress approve major new federal regulations. But you'd probably all agree that it's going to be hard to get 60 votes in the Senate, and the next time the Democrats get a supermajority, they could repeal it. So my question is, what would any of you like, or what are your thoughts about this Regulation Freedom Amendment, which is the constitutional version of the REINS Act to require that regulations have to be approved by Congress, which is now backed by 900 state legislators, unanimous vote of the Republican National Committee, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, American Farm Bureau, National Taxpayers Union. What are your thoughts on that amendment and the idea that maybe in the same way that states forced Congress to propose the Bill of Rights, pressure from the states without a convention could force Congress to do some kind of regulatory reform?
Well, I'll jump in first. Having sponsored or actually authored a couple of constitutional amendments in my own career, including a spending limit amendment, I think we all know that getting a constitutional amendment passed is very, very heavy lifting. I have not studied the language carefully. I certainly would approve the concept. I think that the REINS Act on a statutory level is one of the most important laws we could pass for reclaiming our Article I legislative powers and for restoring balance within our Constitution. I would prefer to have that protected in the Constitution, but I think we probably have to win the battle that is before us before the one that's over the hill. And the battle that is before us is, can we get enough initiative going to get this passed into law? And so that's where my focus is.
Yeah, I agree. The passage of the REINS Act is one of the most important things we can do. So this is the Regulatory Budget Act that we're talking about today solves one aspect of the problem. It in no way replaces the need for the REINS Act, and we really need it. I mean, if you're interested in reading more about this, I came out with a book about a year ago called Our Lost Constitution. In Our Lost Constitution, I explained the history of the modern regulatory system. It was created basically during the FDR administration. And one of the New Deal architects of this system was a Harvard law professor named James Landis, who explained at the very outset that to make the regulatory system legitimate, constitutionally speaking, any rules that carried the force of law that were imposed on the American people by these agencies would need to be approved by Congress. In other words, they would need to be treated effectively as proposals. If you're going to regulate the time the lights go on in the Department of State or the Department of Commerce, that's one thing. But if you're going to regulate and issue regulations that are laws affecting the day-to-day lives of the American people, those require enactment by Congress. And that's what's been missing for a long time. So, yeah, I think we need to support the REINS Act, and I think I'd be great with inserting something into the Constitution that would back that up. But we got to get the REINS Act passed first. That's the easier thing to do. That's not to say we shouldn't push on both ends. I'm told I've got to go vote. If I got time before I leave, can I take one more question?
Apparently not.
Okay, they're calling a vote, and I'm going to have to leave.
We all have to.
And but thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.
All right. Since we're running a little bit behind, I'm just gonna move on. I'm David Burton with the Heritage Foundation. I'll be moderating this panel, which is our second and final panel in this event. We have what we're supposed to have 4 panelists, and the first is Jeffrey Rosen, then Sam Batkins, then Wayne Cruz, then Patrick McLaughlin. Basically each panelist is going to speak for about 5 minutes. Then we'll have a Q&A session. The objective is to get done by 11:30 or thereabouts. Let me just say a couple introductory words and then introduce Jeff. Obviously, we've heard a great deal about the adverse economic effects of the modern administrative state. It costs something on the order of $2 trillion a year in terms of economic compliance costs that we might as well just burn the money for all the good that it does us. But also there's a secondary effect that often is overlooked, but the George Mason Mercatus Center looked at, and that is what economists would call the deadweight loss or excess burden or lost economic output associated with the regulations. And the Mercatus Center calculates that the regulations that have come into place since 1980 have reduced annual economic output by roughly $4 trillion a year. And that amounts to nearly $13,000 per man, woman, and child in the country. That's a vast amount of money. So if you think about that, and you think about all the angst that we're currently suffering because of the slowdown in economic growth, the fact that wages are not increasing, the job creation, particularly for young people, is waning, I think that the subject matter of this event today is probably the central reason, and usually a neglected reason, for most of our economic problems. The regulatory cost has simply gotten out of control and become a tremendous drag on economic growth. Lastly, I'd like to bring to your attention a publication that Heritage does called Red Tape Rising. It's a little different than the Mercatus or CEI work, both of which are excellent and that you should dig up. But Red Tape Rising looks at more an incremental approach. In other words, what's happening this year and traces it during any given administration. And in this administration, there's been 184 major rule. A major rule is an administrative law term of art, meaning it has an economic effect of more than $100 million. And it's estimated to cost more than $80 billion additional in compliance costs annually. Now let me turn to introducing Jeff Rosen. He's a partner with the law firm of Kirkland & Ellis in Washington, D.C., where he's worked for the past 30 years. He's also a former general counsel for the White House OMB and former general counsel of the U.S. Department of Transportation. He's currently the chairman of the American Bar Association's section of Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice and a member of the Administrative Conference of the United States. He's written numerous articles on regulation, but there's particularly one that's in the National Affairs that was sitting on the counter there that I would recommend to you. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and has a BA in economics from Northwestern University. Jeff.
Thanks very much. I'm very pleased to be here and applaud the Kirby Center for hosting this. There are lots of important things in the regulatory budget bill, and they build off years of history with these issues and ideas. So I want to focus on just a couple of aspects that I'll cover quickly, particularly on the idea that this regulatory budget bill builds on a lot of history. This is not the first time regulatory budget has come up, but it's a a version that takes advantage of a lot of history. So the one thing I wanted to mention was the origins of the regulatory budget concept are useful to know because they go back 35 years. As the costs of regulation first started becoming clear in the late 1970s, there was a lot of concern about this, and there was identification of the need to focus on how to apply fiscal concepts for priority setting, allocation, cost effectiveness. And the origin of the concept was bipartisan. The first regulatory budget bill was proposed by a Democratic Senator, Lloyd Benson, in 1978, in a bill called S-3550, I should say, the Federal Regulatory Budgeting Act. And Senator Benson, as some of you may remember, was later Michael Dukakis' running mate in 1988 and President Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury. But he was a proponent of the regulatory budget. In 1980, President Carter's economic report of the president called for this concept. By the 1990s, there were numerous bills that were proposed. One that I'll just mention, in 1993, S-13 came from Senator Hatch, and it was a version of a bill that would say each new regulation has to be offset by one old one. Well, lo and behold, just in recent years, we've seen one of the senators from Virginia has publicly supported that concept, although oddly not introduced a bill. So the point I want to make is this idea has been around for a while. As the members spoke, there's been an abdication of the need for Congress to grab hold of it, but the idea in its virtues in the regulatory state are pretty clear. Let me turn to the second point, which is regulations are laws. Sometimes we forget about that. And so for any of us, certainly for me as a lawyer, but I think anybody who's interested in constitutional government, we have this anomalous situation that laws are being made by someone other than the people that were elected to make them. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. So what does this bill do? It does two things to address the accountability problem that I think are very important, both transparency and accountability, because it's not just a financial planning tool. One is it requires the president to propose what level of spending compliance costs he wants each year, or she wants each year, and it requires members of Congress each year to vote on that. So it restores accountability to the process by putting in at least overall parameters. It may not prevent an individual bad rule, but it puts overall limits on it and restores accountability to Congress. The second thing it does is it deals with this constitutional anomaly of Congress having delegated its authority. It says, well, how can it get some control back on that since the Supreme Court has said legislative vetoes are not allowed? And it does this by using the budget process to use the appropriations bills to again have votes that are binding and restrict what agencies can do. And so in both those ways, the bill restores accountability, transparency, and enables the virtues of improving the regulatory process while restoring essential accountability to our governmental system. And so for both those reasons, I suggest it deserves to again have bipartisan support. Hopefully 60 in the Senate, I would say. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Sam Batkins. Sam is the Director of Regulatory Policy at the American Action Forum. Prior to joining the forum, he worked for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Taxpayers Union. He has a JD from Catholic University and a BA in Political Science from Sewanee, the University of the South. Sam.
Thanks so much, and thanks to the Article 1 Project for putting this event on. I know there are a lot of numbers in the regulatory world. I just want to throw out another one that I hope will help conceptualize where we are and what decades of delegation and regulatory accumulation have wrought, and that's 11.5 billion, which is the number of hours, according to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that Americans spend filling out paperwork every year. Now, per capita, that 11.5 billion, if you divide it by 323 million Americans, works out to roughly 35 hours. So that's either 35 hours of doing nothing but filling out paperwork, drinking a lot of caffeine, or roughly a week's worth of productivity for every single person in the U.S., from my 3-year-old daughter to my 83-year-old grandmother. So that's where we are as a baseline. It is roughly a week, and that's just a slice of the regulatory state. That's just the paperwork that we fill out from healthcare forms, tax forms, every basic encounter we have with the regulatory state. And the regulatory budget, I think, is important because two important components. Number one is better oversight from Congress, which has been touched on, and two is better analysis from the agencies, which is probably equally important. You can have a regulatory budget, but if you don't know the figures coming in are accurate, then the budget doesn't really do you much. On the better oversight front, if you look at the power that Congress has now, and we've sort of talked about this, to check regulation is pretty limited. We can pass a Congressional Review Act resolution, which the Senate did last night, and the President plans to veto as soon as he gets back. Congress can hold oversight hearings, which are common as we watch administration officials sit awkwardly in chairs on TV or in person, and we can pass appropriations riders, which occasionally have some effect, but they're typically pretty limited. So Congress's toolbox now is limited, and I think make no mistake, a regulatory budget would be a sea change in in Congress's relation to the executive state. Being able to set the budget for each particular agency would be pretty profound in terms of its relation to the executive branch. The second component is better analysis, and I know some of the work that Patrick and Mercatus have done have found that generally, if you look at the analysis from agencies, that I think, put it mildly, poor to failing. That's not every agency, but generally, I think the C's and D's and F's are the most common grade. And if you look back at sort of the history of regulatory reform, we've had a lot of regulatory reform back in the 80s and the mid-90s. And from the agency's perspective, the penalty for violating the Paperwork Reduction Act, for example, is nothing. If you fill out a particular form and it turns out the agency didn't have authority to impose that form on you, then pretty much nothing happens. And every year, OIRS sends out a report saying, well, it's supposed to be every year. Hadn't happened the last few years. But they're supposed to send out a report every year detailing hundreds of violations of the Paperwork Reduction Act, and nothing happens. Every year there's hundreds of violations of the Congressional Review Act, agencies not submitting rules to Congress and GAO, and there's no penalty. And what Senator Lee's regulatory budget does is it has two important components. Number one is a private right of action for individuals to sue, and obviously agencies tend to pay a bit more attention if they think the regulations are going to wind up in court. And the second component, probably equally as important, is the ability of OMB to withhold funds from agencies if they try to violate the certain budget provisions that Congress has laid out in the regulatory budget. So having regulatory reform is great, but knowing that the numbers going into it are accurate and knowing that agencies will actually follow the regulatory reform that Congress has passed is probably equally as important. And finally, I think this goes without saying that we live in a world of unlimited wants and limited resources. And on the fiscal side, we recognize that, and we have a budget. Even if we can't balance it, we at least know what's going out and what's coming in. In the regulatory world, it's very much a black box, where we have some idea, maybe from a few rules, of their possible costs, and then 5-10 years down the road, we have little to no clue what's going on in terms of did they provide the benefits that they were intended to provide. So a regulatory budget would help Congress and the American people just get a better picture of the regulatory state, whereas right now we're sort of just feeling our way around in the dark. Thanks so much.
Those remarks made me think of something. You mentioned the 11 billion hours that OMB officially estimates. Those shouldn't be taken too seriously because they tend to radically underestimate the actual costs. A few months back, I happened to look up in the OMB control box on the Form S1, which is what you have to file if you go public. And the number of hours that it took to go public, according to OMB, was 1 hour. Right? And in point of fact, the SEC itself estimates that it costs $2.5 million in lawyers, accountants, and management time to go public, which nobody bills $2.5 million an hour. And the other example that comes to mind is the Labor Department persuader rule. The DOL estimated that it would only affect a few dozen firms. In point of fact, it would affect the tens of thousands of firms. So either way there, they tend to totally and radically underestimate the true cost of these regulations. So anytime you look at an official government estimate, take it with a grain of salt. Which raises one other thing I'd like to raise before I introduce Wayne, and that is, you talked a little bit, Sam, about how it's necessary for the agencies to improve their analysis. I personally believe it's very important that as part of this national regulatory budget process, that a third party is doing the estimate of these costs, not the agencies who've been given political marching orders from the political appointees to make it happen on the economic side. It's now my pleasure to introduce Wayne Cruz of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Wayne publishes a very excellent and ambitious annual study called 10,000 Commandments that looks at the overall regulatory costs imposed by the federal government on the American people. I commend that to you. He is the Vice President for Policy and the Director of Technology Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He is the author of a number of books, as well as the 10,000 Commandments report that I mentioned. He holds an MBA from William and Mary and a Bachelor of Science from Lander College in South Carolina.
Hi, everybody. I guess some of the takeaway from this today is the Constitution isn't perfect, but it's better than what we have now. And I hope that this the reg budget idea can move us forward on restraining the growth of the state. I think what the senator was trying to do with this bill is really important because, in a way, the problem is a lot worse than he's pointing out. You know, we put together figures compiled largely from government estimates of the cost of regulation. And my placeholder for the cost of regulation, looking at a lot of those turn-of-the-century studies and all of the federal studies since then, is close to $2 trillion. I use a 1.88 trillion cost of regulation, but there are a lot of folks out there who will tell you that the cost of regulations are a lot more. There are a number of costs that we can't measure, and when you look at the sheer source of lawmaking in the country, I think it should alarm folks, because last year Congress passed and the President signed 114 laws. But meanwhile, the agencies put out 3,410 regulations. So there's 30 regulations for every law. I like to call it the unconstitutionality index. We put it out as a little cute thing. But the agencies, they go beyond that, because it's not just that they put out those 3,400 laws, but in terms of this question of cost and benefits of regulations that we're discussing, if there are 3,400 rules came out last year, but in OMB's report, there were a few hundred of them that were considered significant and that OMB looked at as they sped by during the year. But of those, there were 54 that were major rule reviews, 16 with cost estimates, but out of the 3,400 rules, the number of regulations that had official OMB cost estimates was only the 13. So out of 3,400 rules, you just get a dozen or so that actually get any cost-benefit analysis. So it's a real problem. And of those rules that go through, even under the Administrative Procedure Act processes, they aren't getting appropriate review. There was a GAO study that pointed out that of all the regulations that go through, 44% of rules did not have a notice of proposed rulemaking. And of the major rules, it was 35%. So a lot of rules aren't even getting the analysis there that they need. Now, the problem is even worse, because imagine if you go outside and you look at the sun, you look at the moon, you look at the stars, you think you're seeing the universe. You're not. That makes up less than 5% of the universe. Most of the universe is so-called dark energy and dark matter. The same thing is happening with regulations. Because the agencies are not just issuing these rules, but they're issuing guidances, notices, bulletins, circulars, letters, and so on down the line. It's virtually a word salad of these things that we'd put together in a report last year. And this is all a spinoff kind of the pen and phone era that we're in with this president. The agencies are going to go around Congress if they can, and they often do. There are several examples of it. Just recently, the Housing and Urban Development put out a policy that said, if you have a blanket policy of denying rentals or homeownership to people with a criminal record, that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Congress never passed that. That's a piece of regulatory dark matter. Similarly, the Labor Department put out a blog post and then an administrative notice saying that, excuse me, excuse me, a blog post, an administrative notice saying that most independent contractors are now going to be employees. In 2013, in July, I believe it was, the Treasury Department put out a blog post and a notice saying that the employer mandate under Obamacare was going to be extended, and therefore the penalty under Obamacare wouldn't apply. That was done without any law from Congress, and it was certainly economically significant and had a huge impact. Later in the year, in November, the Treasury Department, the Health and Human Services Department put out a notice saying that of all the insurance contracts that are out there that are illegal, suddenly they're going to they were illegal under Obamacare, suddenly they were going to be extended, they were going to be legal for another year. So the agencies are going along and through the pen and phone and in the current environment are regulating without going through the notice and comment procedure at all. They're using these guidance documents and notices and bulletins and so forth. Regulatory dark matter, as we started to call it too. And what that means, though, and the good thing about the regulatory budget bill now is that regulatory dark matter in the future or agency guidances are going to be subject to review under regulatory budgeting. If it's a regulatory guidance that is economically significant, it will need to be budgeted as well. And also, if people have been harmed by guidances that have occurred that didn't get analysis, they'll have cause of action. So I think the regulatory budget in context with the REINS Act, with regulatory reviews, with with sunsetting, with one in, one out, which in a way is kind of a regulatory freeze, all of these kind of things kind of come together to put Congress back in the driver's seat and restore congressional accountability for the regulatory state. But I think you have to keep in mind that the problems are far worse because it's not just that the agencies are putting out rules, but they're putting out guidances that are taking over and need to be addressed as well.
It's certainly been my experience that the guidance and other non-official Administrative Procedure Act regulatory initiatives have taken over because it enables the agencies to, in effect, evade the Administrative Procedure Act. So we need to tighten that in a number of respects. Our last speaker will be Patrick McLaughlin. He is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Mercatus does a wide range of excellent work on regulations, including Patrick's own. He has published recently a paper that looks at the overall economic loss associated with regulations since 1980 that I commend to you. I mentioned it in my introductory remarks, and he puts the number at roughly $4 trillion. He also is an adjunct professor at the Department of Economics and at the School of Law at George Mason University. He recently published a book with Oliver Scharos, The Impact of Federal Regulations on the 50 States. Prior to joining Mercatus, he was a senior economist at the Federal Railroad Administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation. He holds a PhD in economics from Clemson University. Patrick?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Senator Lee mentioned complexity multiple times in his talk, and I think that's a good word to keep in mind as one of the reasons that we're here today. Complexity is a result of the regulatory process that we have, and complexity has consequences. So some statistics you've heard a lot already, but some more that can convey the complexity of regulation. In 1970, there were about 54,000 pages of federal regulations in effect. Today, there's over 175,000 pages of federal regulations in effect. If you were to try to read the regulations in effect right now as a full-time job year-round, it would take you over 3 years to read through it all. So there's a more complex body of regulations than any individual or any agency or any politician, for that matter, could ever possibly understand, and that has consequences not only in the sense of there being a lack of accountability, a lack of representative democracy going on, but in the sense that there's economic consequences. There's compliance costs that we're able to some degree tally up and measure, but then there's also some growth consequences for how the economy performs over the long run. The fact is, the current process of analyzing these regulations does not tell us much about the consequences of them, either whether they're too costly for what benefits they deliver, or even whether they actually deliver the benefits that they're supposed to. Sam hinted at some of the analysis that we've done of the quality of analyses that come out of agencies themselves, and it's not very pretty. The simple fact is we just don't know that much about the effectiveness of regulations, about the benefits or costs of them. Agencies will tend to focus on compliance, but not on consequence. We need to focus on consequence. So our basic problem, and one problem that this bill, I think, is trying to address, is the lack of information of the effects of regulation. A study I've recently put out has been mentioned a few times, and I think that this study may serve as a template for how a process for economic analysis of both legislation and regulation that comes out of legislation could be implemented that's comprehensive, robust, and credible. So this study was one I did with a couple of co-authors from Duke University, Bentley Coffey and Pietro Pareto. We looked at regulatory accumulation, not just a single rule at a time, as tends to be the process now, but the whole body of regulations that have built up over time, and wanted to see how regulatory accumulation affects the decisions made by operators in the economy, by firms and by individuals in the economy. Specifically, the decisions that lead to innovation. These are the business investment decisions like research and development, or expansion of existing facilities, or building a new facility, or buying new machinery. These are the sorts of investment decisions that lead to innovation. So really, if you want to summarize what this study is getting at, we're saying, what is the cost in terms of creativity that the buildup of regulation has? What sort of innovation do we lose because of the buildup of regulation over time? And the reason we focus on innovation is because that's the primary driver of economic growth in the long run. The end result, you've heard a number of $4 trillion, that comes from the lost economic growth from the distorted business decisions that regulation leads to. You know, one way of thinking about this is if you are a would-be entrepreneur and you're trying to establish and create some new product and get it out there, the task of threading the needle where you create that new product but don't run afoul of regulations gets exponentially harder as these regulations build up. And it's not just each one, it's them together as a group. They interact and they create a very constraining environment that businesses have to operate in. Our end result was we found that average economic growth is slowed by about 0.8% each year because of the constraining effects of regulation on investment decisions by firms. That led to a loss of economic growth that totaled $4 trillion by the year 2012 if you went back to 1980 and added up that effect over time. Of course, you can go back farther in time, and the effect is going to get larger and larger the farther back you go. But the point of this talk is not just to highlight that study. It's to talk about how the methodology used in that study could be learned from in any sort of implementation of a process that embraces economic analysis to understand the costs of regulation in the regulatory process. So some of the major obstacles that study overcame and some of the principles embraced there could perhaps be replicated. First, I guess the simplest thing is this study and our approach was just sound and transparent science. We created a methodology that anyone could look at and understand, with some work, understand, and most importantly, it was all laid out there for people to agree or disagree with. The biggest issue in doing this was the measurement issue. How do we measure the quantity of regulations there are, the volume of regulations coming out of different agencies and affecting different sectors of the economy? We had a solution to that that's objective, that's replicable, and importantly, it's comprehensive, that looks at all the regulations that there are, not just some subset of regulations. Second, we had a model that, again, was transparent. It was built, most importantly, I think, on microeconomic foundations, accepted theory. So others would see this and understand, okay, you're not talking about some macroeconomic effects that I don't really understand. You're talking about the decisions of individuals and firms. That makes some sense. That's something that economics is very clear about, and we built upon that. And then third, I think probably the final point to dwell on is the dynamic effects. We're not looking at just compliance costs or static effects. We want to know how a firm that has to spend money to comply with a regulation then alters the other decisions. Where would that money have gone to had it not been spent on compliance? that sort of dynamic effect, and then the long-run decisions that are altered going forward they can amount to a much more serious consequence than just simple compliance costs alone. So those three approaches, I guess the final one, you could think of that as a version of dynamic scoring. There's dynamic scoring of legislation that considers how people react to changes in tax rates, for example. Here we're considering dynamic reaction to regulation, and that, I think, is something that could be incorporated into whatever is built to understand the effects of regulation. So I'll wrap up with that. I think that there were some questions that were asked earlier that may be partially answered by this, but I'll leave it to the question and answer session. Thanks.
Patrick talked about the cumulative burden of regulation growing. I started practicing law in the 1980s, and until about 4 years ago, was representing small, medium-sized businesses. And I can state with an absolute degree of certainty, and I'm about to use some technical terms, the burden of regulation in the United States has gone from the merely ridiculous to the absolutely insane over that period of time. And it's basically to the point now where you really need to be a lawyer to run a business in this country. But we don't want lawyers running all our businesses if we want our businesses to succeed. And if you look at some of the indicators of entrepreneurial health today, you see that this is having a real world effect. Until last year, business exits actually exceeded business formations for the first time since they started keeping numbers. The level of IPOs is a fraction of what it is, even with the very healthy stock market. And then the job creation in the startup business community is a fraction of what it used to be. And so on down the line. These regulations, while they sound technical and highly theoretical and all this, are having very demonstrable adverse economic effects on the well-being of the American people. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. We're going to do about 10 minutes of questions and then wrap it up. Yes, sir, in the back.
Has there been any way to look at, like, in the cost of regulation, some kind of like useful versus useless measure? I mean, it's because thinking when you say there's 4 trillion costs, a lot of people say, well, some of that is, having to buy this thing so that you're not spewing horrible acids in the sky. Is there any way to separate out like what's paperwork versus what's buying new technology, something like that?
Just jump in.
Yeah, one of the operational things about a regulatory budget is figuring out how you're going to count it, because you can break up regulatory costs into economic, social, environmental, paperwork, things like that. And this regulatory budget would do it by functional group in the committees and so forth. But that's one of the criticisms that you'll hear about this particular effort. The more traction it gets, and it's probably what you'll see in the counter quotes if there are stories about this today. What about the benefits? Why don't we take and look at net benefits of all of these regulations? The way to counter that, I think, is remember that the free market, or laissez-faire, whatever you call it, does not mean companies get to run wild and do whatever they want to do. There's regulation in free markets too. In fact, I would argue that there's more, and that when you try to replace that with bureaucracy, you end up making people worse off. Remember, companies aren't operating in a vacuum. They've got their upstream suppliers, downstream customers, Wall Street, consumers, media, all these forces arrayed against them. And I think it's important for us to focus on the costs of regulations here in the same way that with say, the tax code. Paying taxes, we focus just on the cost side. We don't say we get a lot of benefits out of the welfare state and it doesn't cost us anything, or we get a lot of benefits out of the military so it doesn't cost us anything. We just need to know the compliance and other GDP and other kinds of cost here and work to calculate those, because believe me, costs are enough, and as I pointed out there are only a handful of rules that the agencies actually do a reviewed cost-benefit analysis of. So effectively, there isn't any cost-benefit analysis right now to even argue about. So when we talk about a regulatory budget, we should focus on the cost side, but point out the market's role in enhancing those benefits, because food safety, financial stability, health, environmental amenities, all of those are forms of wealth. Privacy, cybersecurity, going down the line, they're all forms of wealth, and they need markets to enhance them, not just regulators.
Yeah, let me just jump in with a quick thought. The way budgets work on the fiscal side would apply on the regulatory side. So if you say we're going to allow an agency, let's say the Department of Education, to do $50 million of new regulatory costs next year, The way benefits come in is you figure out, all right, which ones to do, because they could be considering 100 different rules. And having the budget forces them to rank order. Oh, this one has lots of benefits. This one has a few. This one has minimal. But we can only do a few. We only have a budget of $50 million to deal with. I'm making up the number. It can be whatever Congress wants it to be. So benefits comes in to prioritizing within your budget. If you use benefits to set the budget, you've essentially got rid of it, because first of all, the benefits are much softer, and the agencies quantify them with a lot less rigor. But second, you've undone the budget. You've just said anything that's good will do, and we don't have the resources to do that. That's why we have budgets.
Well, I might add one other thing, that if in the extraordinarily unlikely event that it's actually worthwhile to put further regulatory burdens on the American people, they can come up to Congress and say, we need to lift the regulatory budget cap because it's worth doing this extra rule. But they have to actually persuade the Congress of that fact, just like they do to spend money. Next question. Yes, sir. It might also be helpful if you say your name and institutional affiliation before you ask your question. Can you wrap it up and ask the question?
There's an interesting forum going on Cato Unbound on the source of the administrative state, and it's quite interesting. Senator Lee did indicate that it's Congress who's allowed all this to occur. That's first of all assumed all of this power, and in the second instance delegated it. And it's, in a way, it's worse than you say, because we already have the array of agencies out there now who, in the way I think about things, as technology proceeds, as society proceeds, we're able to deal with so-called market failures and things like that on our own without resorting to the state. But you see the agencies are moving ahead on net neutrality, jumping out in front of internet governance. They're moving ahead on cybersecurity. They're jumping out in front of the driverless cars. With Sam was mentioning the communication systems between them this morning, the rules coming out. Maybe they don't need to communicate. Maybe they only need to detect. Or maybe the driverless cars are going to be a husk in the future and you just snap something in them to go. The whole industries are changing, but the agencies are jumping in. Same with drones. The FAA is trying to regulate drones. Theoretically, not that you would want it, but with technologies on the way, you could pack the sky like a neutron star with drones. But instead, the FAA is moving in with the old legacy, decades-old regulation of the air traffic control system that they're putting it in. So you see, in all of the areas, the agencies are already there, ready to jump in. So you need something like at least those are economic regulations. So you need some kind of a budget like Lee is talking about to rein back on that. And you want to get a situation where one agency's least effective rule has got to be better than the other ones, within that budget constraint. And that's the other thing about the regulatory budget is finally, for once, you're looking at the regulatory state as a whole. See, as it is now, when agencies are doing these cost-benefit analysis, they're just thinking within their own square. But if you've got that overall cap, Congress is making the trade-offs among agencies. So at least it's a start. But I agree with you that the question of the government's got too much power. I mean, great. I would love if they just picked a national bird and then left us alone. But it doesn't work that way. They've got a lot of power now, and remember, liberty's young. Our Constitution's young. All of the founding documents are out on the internet. John Locke's work is on the internet. The youth can rediscover it, and we can reinstitute it. There'll always be in America. It just may not be here. So.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question as well. I think that it could be described as there's increased demand for government intervention. Maybe it's for more safety or environmental reasons. And so if that's the demand, if voters are demanding more regulation or intervention, let's say, is there fundamentally a problem here? And I think there still is, in the sense that we don't know if the interventions are actually solving what they're supposed to, if they're delivering what's actually being demanded. That is a fundamental problem. There's not a good feedback loop that lets legislators, much less voters, understand the consequences in terms of both benefits and costs of those interventions. And second, I think that there's an approach by Congress that leads to this long-run accumulation, and that is permanent delegation of these areas. If there's demand for a solution to a specific problem, and Congress wants to delegate that to an agency, you don't have to create a permanent agency that will then, 30 years later, find something else to make rules about. You can create a vehicle that will solve that specific problem through delegation and through their expertise, if that's what you want.
One more question. Yes, sir. The microphone.
I don't know whether this is naive. Oh, incidentally, my name is Joe Ryan, and I have no institutional affiliation, although my wife thinks I belong in one once in a while. But I would pose this, and it's more or less of a, perhaps it's a little naive, but what would it take in a assembly like this to have a panel? Before we were talking about bipartisanship relative to this issue. What do you suppose it would take to have a panel on a bipartisan level, people from both sides of the aisle, to engage in this sort of discussion? I think there are some people on the other side of the aisle who might fit in that picture.
I mean, I'd say on the regulatory budget side that I think progressives and Democrats should at least, and some of them have, discuss how the budget takes place in a forum, because presumably in some time in the future, there's going to be a president with whom they have ideological disagreements. And I'm sure they'll want to have some say in the regulatory process and setting regulatory budgets. And if they control both houses of both branches of Congress, then they'll have some say. And they'll work with the president to establish a regulatory budget. So obviously, I think a lot of progressives might dismiss the idea, but I think there should be some strong support. After one, this is the Article 1 project, not just a Republican project. So any member of Congress who's a Democrat or Republican should care about their constitutional role, and I think some will going forward.
And I'll just harken back to, as I said, the origin of the first bill was from a Democrat and Senator Benson. There seemed to be waves in time. There was a period when many Democrats were interested in deregulation of trucking, airlines, and the like. So, the fact that today there may not be as much bipartisanship doesn't mean that we can't necessarily aspire to get the joint interest in this. There should be on this particular issue. There are reasons sometimes things are polarizing, but this is one that has at least the potential to be bipartisan. And I think it should be.
You want to say something, Patrick?
Well, I think the last point that Jeff made is really good. The transportation, the partial deregulation of transportation that occurred really started in the late 70s, came about because of really crisis. And it may be crisis that will be required to have something come up again that will lead to really substantive change. Otherwise, it's hard to get people to take the risk, get politicians to take the risk of embracing this sort of idea.
All right, we have one announcement before the event concludes, but this concludes the panel.
And I'd like to thank Mr. Burton for moderating and the panelists for their remarks and for all of you for coming. And I just want to draw to your attention that on June 7th from 6:30 to 8 p.m., we'll be hosting Yuval Levin for our next AWC lecture, where he'll be discussing his new book, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in an Age of Individualism. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you for coming.